Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Figma for EDU monthly workshop. My name is Mickey, and today we're going to be talking about using layout grids in Figma. I love grids. One of the reasons I got into using Figma was the way that they handled design layout grids, and I'm really glad to share some of this knowledge with y'all today. Once again, if you want to follow along, you can head on over to figma.com/@education and duplicate the file that I'm currently working out of so you can follow along with what we're doing today. Just to begin, grids help you organize your layouts while designing. It allows you to be consistent across many screens. So if you think about creating design systems, when you create design systems, you create components and styles and tokens, so then that way other folks can design with the same visual language. Grids are very similar in that they allow you to establish rules for your layout. And while rules can be broken, we're going to highlight and showcase some of those rules today so you can then break them. But once again, they help improve that consistency, they help demonstrate your intent, and they help reduce the choices that you have to make by giving you a structure, a scaffolding to work from. So you could see right here, this page has a grid applied to it. And in order to see the grid in the file, you're going to press Shift G. So you'll notice in this page, when I press Shift G, it hides the grid. When I press Shift G, it shows the grid. The grid is going to be controlled over in the properties panel over here on the right. So when I select this frame, I come over here on the right, you're going to scroll down and you're going to see this little window that says layout grid. From here, we can create rows, we can create columns, we can adjust things like margins and gutters. And if you're unfamiliar with those terms, we're going to cover them right now. So once again, that grid toggle is going to be Shift G. We hide the grid and we view the grid using that shortcut. And we're going to jump right into it. So this right here is the first concept that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about creating columns. So I'm going to hop down here and I'm going to start to work, and you're going to see how I can construct this. I'm going to press the F key. When I press the F key, that means that this is the frame tool. You'll notice over here on the right, I can choose from available frames. Could make that a little bit wider there, and I could choose from the available frames that are here. So I can click down to presentation. I'm going to click a 16:9 slide, and it's going to add that to my window. Another way that you can add a frame is just by pressing the F key, and you can draw one out there. But you see the frame that we've created here, that's going to be the structure by which we're going to place our grids. I'm going to select this frame. I'm going to come down here to layout grid, and you'll notice that when I create that first layout grid, you see that we have these very small grid lines. So the default is a vertical and horizontal grid at 8 pixels. I'm going to click here to the left to open up the grid layout settings, and I can move that panel here to the center. I can set this value to be much larger. So right now, at a value of 8, inside of a 1920 by 1080 width frame, they're quite small. So if I increase that size to 80, you can see those grid blocks in this space. And once again, this is the default grid. It works with both columns and gutters. And you can see if I press the R key, I can draw out a rectangle, and I can snap this rectangle to that grid. And it helps me align that object as I am placing it there. So we're going to talk about columns now. So right now you can see that it's applying evenly the value of 80 pixels both to the columns and the rows. But what we're going to do here is, once again, we're going to open up this setting and we're going to click on this drop down. And what we're going to do is choose columns. So we're just going to pick columns for now. So right now I have a few options here. So I can choose a column count of 5. I can increase that value. Let's say I want to choose 12. There we go. The next thing that I'm going to be considering is the type of grid that I'm working with. whether it's going to be stretched, centered, right, or left. For the time being, I'm just going to leave it stretched. And in a later example, we're going to walk through how to use those other options. The width here is going to be automatic. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the margin and the gutters. So when I come up here, you're going to notice the margins are on the outset, right? It gives us this white space outside of our area to design, because if the objects are pushed right up against the borders, they're going to be harder to read. We want to give it some breathing area. The gutters are in the middle and they separate out the columns. Now, if you have zero gutter, like if I bring this down to zero, right, you're going to see it's flush. There's just single lines there. But once we start to add a gutter value, then you have a sense of the width of your columns. I'm going to set my gutter here to 16, and I'm going to set my margin there to 8, and you can see how it affects the layouts as you work. Now, traditionally, when we think about user interface design, we often think in terms of defining the gutters first, and then defining the margins first, and then defining the gutters, and then the columns you have kind of grow and contract. So that's what we're demonstrating here, where these columns, their widths are currently set to auto by the type being stretch. And that means that if I increase or decrease the width of this frame, those columns are going to follow whatever that width determines after setting the margins on the outside and the gutters in the middle. Fun fact, they didn't always used to be gutters. They were originally called alleyways, but they were misnamed as gutters in Adobe's InDesign software, and forever since, we now refer to them as gutters. So fun fact for those of y'all out there, they used to be called alleys. So margin, gutter, count. And I want you to become very familiar with these properties, because understanding and controlling them is what's going to give you much more intent when generating your designs. So here we've created a few columns here. Columns are helpful for breaking up space. So when you think about a design, right now I'm drawing in some black rectangles here. It helps you think about how you're going to serve up the different spacing of your design. So you've probably seen a 3 across layout, right? You can then take this and break it up into 4s, where you can have areas of your design be brought up and organized in this way. So a value of 12, because it's both divisible by 4 and 3, allows you to designate these areas that you might then work from. So I'm already seeing a question: what are the best practices for creating a brand guideline? What we're going to do is we're going to cover some of these basics, and then we're going to start talking about like identifying that intent. So what it means is that it always depends on what you're trying to demonstrate and what you're trying to show. And I have some examples a little bit later that'll help you better understand what you're going to be doing when you decide on building out these gutters. I've already covered this, but flush columns just mean that objects are going to be butting right up once against another. And we're actually going to talk about taking columns and finding those midpoints within those gutters to have a more fluid and compound design. But I did want to highlight the difference between having gutters and margins versus just having lines that are flush and touching one another, and both can be used in your designs. Next up, we're going to talk about rows. So when you create a design, it's not just about columns, but it's also working with rows. I see commonly a lot of UI designs focus heavily on columns, but don't really think or consider how rows can be implemented to help establish a good vertical rhythm in design. You'll see here we have a grid. Once again, the margins for rows would be on the top and the bottom, and the gutters will sit in the middle. And I'm going to show you all some really cool tricks with typography to get your objects to snap either on a baseline grid or in a modular grid with these rows. So stay tuned. I'm going to press the F key once again. I'm going to draw out a frame. I'm going to make this frame, let's say, a little bit more narrow. I'm just going to name this rows. and I'm going to demonstrate how we can create rows. I'm going to click on layout grid. I'm going to come over here to the grid settings, and here I'm going to choose rows. Now, this time it's going to be very similar to how we worked with the columns previously. I can set the count of 6. I can apply a margin of, like, let's say 48, and the gutter of, let's say 16. Now, previously we worked with that stretch value, but when we're dealing with rows, we can also start to think about setting them as defined values. So let's say instead of having stretched rows, and what I mean by that is as the height stretches, the rows stretch, we could instead say that we want those rows to be generated from the top, and we can set a specific height value. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and push up. And what that's going to do, it's going to iterate by values of 8 using the nudge setting in Figma. If you're unfamiliar with the nudge setting in Figma, just click down here, go to the actions panel, type in nudge amount. When I click nudge amount, you'll see your small nudge and your big nudge. The big nudge is the value by which you're kind of iterating. I'm going to set my small nudge to 1. Sometimes when I'm working on icons, I use 0.5, but here we'll just set it to 1 and the big nudge be 8. What that means is that, once again, when I'm holding the shift key and increasing or decreasing using the arrow key on my keyboard, I'm able to move that up and down. I'll answer that one more time. The nudge is the value by which you're moving an object on your canvas. So if I have an object on my canvas right here, and I move it left or right, it's moving by 1 pixel. But if I hold the shift key, right, it's now moving by 8. I can modify that nudge value by going to the actions panel, clicking on nudge amount, and I could set that nudge amount even more. I could set it to 24. So now when I hold the shift key and I move it, it moves by a value of 24 along that axis. And the way that nudge value is helpful here is that when I select this box and I go to my layout grid, I can adjust that height by my big nudge value by holding the shift key. So Command K, nudge amount, I'm going to set that value to 8. I'm going to click right back in here, and you'll see that I am modifying the height by a value of 8. The value of 8 is really important when it comes to UI design. Once again, it is a value that is used for consistency. It could easily be divided by 2, divided by 4, so it's often used for spacing and other values when designing a UI. So it could be helpful to create a row system based off of that value. So you can see my gutters here, they could be 16 or 24. The height is 128, and the offset is the value that is being offset from the top. It's different than a margin because I can basically just move that down. So it's just like a margin, but only from one side. So the main difference between this and what we created before is that we are using an absolute value to determine our row sizes. So is 8 better than 10 for nudge? I think it all depends on the system that you're working for. We often use 8 in UI design. And then once again, too, some folks use 4 when they're kind of moving micro items. Now, rows are going to be really impactful when you are thinking about other things such as the alignment of your text. And I'm going to get into how we can use that a little bit better. Flush rows, we've already mentioned that. So that's when you have no gutters. They're going to appear just as lines. And that's going to take me to the next concept here, a baseline grid. I'm going to make sure I spend some time here. So some of you have probably heard the term baseline grid. Whenever you're designing elements and you're considering how they're going to be aligned to rows, when you're going vertically top down, assembling a good vertical rhythm is seen as an ideal in design. And you accomplish that by having a consistent value. So a baseline grid is one that's established from the baselines your typography sits on, right? It's a visual aid in your design, and it helps you kind of keep that rhythm. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to make a baseline grid and how to snap your text to it. So I see a question. It's like, what's the difference to be to using a stretch or center. We're going to talk about those in a little bit later. Right now, what I want you to do is at least begin to think about it, and then we're going to start talking when you might use one over the other. And it could be the difference between a responsive design versus a centered or a more structured design. So, baseline grids. I'm going to create another frame down here. And the thing that I want to highlight here with this text, notice the baseline grid that is sitting underneath the text. You'll notice the baseline of the type. That is the point at which your type sits. You'll see descenders go under it. And this is how you get text to sit on the baseline grid. And this way it helps have an established vertical rhythm. When you add additional text later on, it helps you space that text. So when I move this down, I can then assemble it, and you'll see that every line of text is sitting on one of those baselines. So we will cover how to create a baseline grid. You'll see that if you click on this frame and go into layout grid, you'll see how it is assembled. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a few different layouts using different baseline grid sizes and show you how to get text to sit on that baseline grid perfectly every single time. Here, I'm going to press the F key and I'm going to draw out a frame. I'm going to have this frame be an iPhone 16. So we're going to start with an iPhone 16 frame. I'm going to call this phone. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create just a baseline grid, and I'm going to assemble some text to be aligned to that baseline grid in this frame. Let's select that frame. I'm going to come down here to the bottom right. Let's choose layout grid, and we're going to select rows. And what we're going to do here with the baseline grid is we're actually going to go and choose this to be set once again from the top, right? So we're going to set an explicit value. It's not going to stretch to fill the container. We want these rows to just kind of go from the top down. We're going to set the count value. Instead of being an explicit number, we're going to set it to auto. And what that means is that when we set the count of our rows to auto, no matter how tall or how short this is, it's going to continue that rhythm of those rows. So I can go all the way down here, continue to drag that down, and it's going to continue to have those rows. So you'll notice that we're setting the value to go from the top. We've applied our rows. We're setting the count to auto. That auto value just means as tall as our frame is going to be. We could even change the color if we wish. I'm going to darken this for those of y'all in the back. You could see it a little bit better. I'm going to set it to 40. We're going to set the gutter value to be 0. And when we set the gutter value to be 0, you just see these lines. This is currently being set to a height of 8. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase this value for demo purposes of 24. So you can see what we've just done is created a repeating line from the top of 24 units all the way down. If I was to draw a rectangle by pressing the R key and snapping it to one of those lines, you'll see that that first gap is 24, 48, 72, 96, 120. So those lines are created at those even intervals. And what we're going to do is apply text to be aligned to those even intervals. So someone's asking, how do you snap to grid lines again? If you press Command K and you type in snap, you will see all of the snap options that you have available to you. So I have my snap to pixel grid turned on. I have my snap to geometry turned on, and my snap to objects turned on. And that way, when I press the R key, I can click and drag and I can snap that object. And that's going to be super helpful when adding these objects to your grid and aligning them. So to get back on track, we were going to add some text here. I'm going to press the T key I'm going to draw in this line of text. I'm going to cheat and let AI write me a bit of a paragraph here. So I'm going to click on the AI tool. I'm going to say, rewrite this. Not everybody has access to this. This is a beta feature, but just for the purposes of demonstrating, I'm going to say, write a paragraph about donuts. And it's going to write a paragraph about donuts. Okay, so I now have this text field. A few things about the text field that I'm going to add here. I do want to make sure that this text field is set to auto height. It's currently set to fixed. That means that the bounding box is right there. To set it to auto height, all I need to do, double click on that field. Let's see, I just got to drag it down. I can just click auto height over here. But if ever you have a field and you want it to be auto height, double click on that bottom point. It'll make it right there. All right, so we have our text field. I'm going to drag this in. And what I want to do is I want to have this text align to every single line. And I've already done that because I already have a line height that measures it. But that kind of gets to our point. If I was to set this to 32, and if I have a, let's say, a line height of 5, that's way too small, too much. 35, there we go. That's a lot better. So if my line height sets at 35, you'll notice that the text won't align properly. In order for text to align to a baseline grid, its line height needs to be a divisible by that value. So currently, our line height, or our distance between two grid lines, is 24, right? So the distance between those two grid lines right there, that is 24 pixels. So in order for us to get our text to match up with that line height, it just needs to be divisible by it. And if they share a common divisor, so it's 4, then that means every so often the text will line up. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to set my line height to 48, 48 being 24 times 2. And you'll notice when I put that first line onto the baseline, every single line of text lines up appropriately. If I was to change my font size, let's say my font size goes down a bit. Let's choose maybe 21 as my font size. I can set a line height of 24. And then what you'll notice, once I move this text field so the first baseline matches, every baseline matches the line of text there. Even if this text continues to go on and on, as long as the line height is divisible by the baseline grid, you will see them match up. Now, if I was to extend this over here, and I was to duplicate this text field, I'm going to press Command D or Control D on Windows, and I was to bring this down. Let's set our line height to a much smaller value, but it's still within that 4s and 8s range. So let's say I bring my line height down to 16, and let's bring my font size down to 14. Then what you'll see is not every line is going to line up, but the main lines will. So you'll notice that right here, let's make a little arrow. Shift L will make a little arrow. So we have this line, which is lined up, and you'll see the pattern still follow, right? And that's because the line height of 16 still shares that common value of 4 that 24 is also going to have. So it's still maintaining a vertical rhythm. And if I can bring down my font size here to 12, as long as I adjust that first line, you will see that the line height is what determines that rhythm. And it allows both of these text fields to kind of live next to each other and still have a pretty good rhythm. Okay. And the reason that that's important is because it helps you determine like your typographic scale and your line heights when working with your text. So even here, if I was to increase that by a value of 4, if I was to go to 20, right, open that up, you'll see then too that it then changes. So this line is aligned, and I think it's going to be a little bit more off, but the values will still hit. It is pure math. Yeah, and it's that line height value, and that's what establishes that rhythm. So oftentimes what people do, even if you take a look at like material design, when they material design is a design system that's kind of implemented by Google. They publish it for everybody to look, and for their Android devices. You know, when they talk about this like underlying grid, they often prefer that folks use values of 4. So if I was to change this layout to a value of 4, it's a little hard to see in the demo, but you'll notice that every line matches up with the text here, right? So even here as well, that value of 4, every line matches up as long as that first baseline is there. And this then becomes important because as you're aligning your text, and you're thinking about adding something like a header, and I can make that header heavier. So let's say I'm making it bold, a little bit larger, 48. I can have this object. Let's also make sure that it's set to auto height. And I'm going to set the line height to 48. I can move these down. And by moving them down with my nudge value, notice that that first line will continue to hit. So I can take this object, I can move it there. I'm going to align them together. And here you can see that I can better control the spacing from baseline to baseline of this text to this text. So even here, as I add in another line, I'll say donuts and more. You'll notice that if I move this down, I line the first baseline, each of those lines will match up because its line height is set to 48. And then the line height of this text is set to 24. And that helps me keep that established vertical rhythm. Other objects that you then place on those rows, move that up. Other objects that you then place on those rows can also snap in there as well. Okay, and this also helps when you move that. So yeah, once again, add Command K, nudge amount. You could change that nudge value right there. If I press Shift G, I can hide that grid. And sometimes when folks have baseline grids, you can hide them right here with the eyeball tool, because sometimes that granularity might be a bit too much. And sometimes when that granularity is too much, I'll show you another trick that I like to work with. So I see someone says their Command K doesn't work. Hit Command P. So if you're using UI2, if you're using the previous user interface of Figma, it's going to be Command P or Control P for the same window. So Command K is the shortcut for UI3. All right, so baseline grid, once again, this is super helpful. I'll show you an example. Exactly, someone's asking how we would work with grids in a sidebar menu. Kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. Here's grids with a sidebar menu. We'll be talking about that in just a minute. So snapping text to the baselines, as long as it's divisible by the baseline, you have turned your snapping on. You can adjust it with a small nudge and place it directly on the line. So the baseline will always snap appropriately. All right, great questions, everybody. So sometimes the baseline is a bit too granular. And what you might want to do is you might want to have text. Let's create a simple row layout here where you're working with the larger rows. So I'm going to click rows. Here, I'm going to set my rows to kind of grow out from the center. And I'm going to set the height of my rows to be, let's say 96. And I'm going to set my gutter to be 16. Both of these values are, once again, divisible by 8. And what we're going to do here is I want to set like macro text to align to every one of these lines. Okay, so the macro text is going to align to every one of these lines. And what I'll show you is over here, back at that intro, you'll see that the text is here and it's aligning and it's still considering these gutters as well. I'm going to show you the shortcut key or the shortcut to accomplishing this as we begin to start thinking about how we might grid a presentation. And then we're going to talk about how we might grid a phone and a mobile device. A phone, a tablet, and a website. So someone had a question about the AI panel. AI panel is still in beta and it's slowly being rolled out to folks. So some folks will have it and some folks won't have it quite yet. Thank you. All right. So having these rows here, what we want to do is accomplish by having our text. So I'm going to say, hello world, how are you today? Let's say I want to have this text align to every single one of those. I'm working with much larger text, let's say like 96 point type. Let's say I set that line height to 96, but you'll notice it's not going to align. So how do we do it? The simple math is I'm going to take and draw a rectangle. I'm going to draw from the top of my grid line and down and include the gutter. So right now, this height is 112, right? So the height of 112. So if our line height matches that 112 and our first baseline hits, then you'll see every line will match. So the shortcut to get text to align when you're working with gutters is to take the height of the row plus the height of the gutter and use that as your line height. And what you can then do is adjust your type size in between those values, right? Snap it to the first baseline, and you'll see that it will then honor that rhythm. I'm going to head on over down here. I have this example where you can see how I'm generating different typographic scales intended for presentation use that then sits on all of those baselines using that value. So basically what it is that this is double that height. This is exactly that height. This is like 1.5 that height. This is half that height. And by using that metric, it helps me understand in establishing those values. So here, what I can do to work down with that typography or that typographic scale, I can select this text. I can move it down here. Let's say that text is going to be a bit smaller. So to snap to baseline, your line height just needs to match the either the baseline grid height. So here it's 4 or be a divisible by 4. And here it's matching when you have a gutter and a row, it has to be the row height plus the gutter height, and then it will snap to the baseline of that row. So here, I'm going to take this text. I'm going to work with much smaller text. Let's go down to about 48. And what I'm going to do here with this line height, I'm going to divide that by 2. A fun thing that you could do here, I could just put in the /, that's the divisor symbol, and then press 2, and it'll give me exactly half of 56. Now that I have 56, you can see that I can paste this text in, and you'll notice that every 2 words matches in on that as well. So I've reduced my font size to 48, and my line height is now effectively half of that value. So once again, the value here is 112. So right here, this is currently set to 112. That's that height. And so by setting text to be half that is effectively 56. So if I change this height to 56, you'll see that we now can get 2 words per line, and it still matches up with those gutters. So I see Jeremy asking a lot of questions, right? And he's talking about matching it up in code. How are we doing this in Figma? So first, what I'm doing is I'm working on these concepts. This can be used to help establish a typographic scale, and this can then lead into the creation of a presentation deck. So I know that I'm focusing right now on rows. So those rows can be applied to a fixed height and fixed sized design. So then that's what allows you to have that consistency. This is currently a demonstration of the basic presentation deck in Figma. So within Figma slides, when you press Shift G, you can also have access to the grids, and this will help you better understand how to create many different layouts that are using that. So here I'm using this large text and then kind of picking which row to add it to. And you can see by using those values, we're better able to then create that one got adjusted, I think. We're then able to create a typographic scale and have consistency in the placement on that text. So while it might not be immediately apparent in creating these, because I'm still kind of going step by step, it can be useful in kind of discerning and troubleshooting and working through a good typographic scale to then establish to. So I know you're jumping the gun. You're already talking about, well, how would I develop this? I'm explaining the concept primarily, and then we're going to dig into how it can be applied. So when you use these concepts together, right? We've talked about the baseline grid. We've talked about adding rows, right? So we've talked about baseline grid. We've talked about adding rows. Next, we could talk about making that more modular, right? And then once you kind of like understand these kind of basics, then you can begin to think about how they implement for your respective purposes, right? So currently I'm talking about more traditional applications of the grid. I have down here in this second page, I actually have a bunch of additional resources that you can kind of look through. So I'll highlight some things there as well. But, right, we're talking about how classically grid works. And by understanding some of these concepts as well, when you start digging into CSS grid, much of these concepts translate immediately over when you start talking about grid areas and grid rows. Is it possible to have? Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to share the little interventions that I did so y'all can go in after the fact. So I can share that out at the end of the workshop. All right. So the next concept that we want to go through is a modular grid. So we've talked explicitly about setting up columns, and we've talked explicitly about setting up rows. And then we kind of talked about setting up that baseline and working through kind of defining our line height and then subsequently our font size in creating this. The reason that this is important is because it helps establish, a baseline from which you can work, right? It's where you determine, okay, this is my large font size, my smaller font size, then occupies this kind of like row space that's like half or a quarter, right? Helps you define what is going to be the math governing, your type choices. Next up, we're going to talk about a modular grid. So for those of you maybe making like a bento layout and are concerned or questioning how to make those easily, this will be super helpful. I'm going to begin by pressing the F key. I'm going to come down here and choose another 16 by 9 slide. Here, I'm now going to stack my grids. I'm going to create a layout grid And here I'm going to choose columns to begin with. And this is where we're going to start talking about some of the choices that you can make. So here, the grid is always going to be dependent on the device that you're working with. So that stretch, once again, is going to be responsive, wherein the stretch is going to be in the column width, and that's going to be responsive to the device width. And by setting that to auto, those columns are also then determined by the gutter. So I'm going to set my gutter as being 48. I'm going to set my margin as being, my margin as being 48 and my gutter as being 16. So we can kind of see these are our additional spaces, and we could set our count to be 12. So yes, stretch is going to help when looking at a website versus tablet versus phone. And it's also been classically the way that folks have ascribed to define a grid. So if I was to look at one of my resources here in material design, I actually don't think it'll pop up on the screen share. But if you were to look at one of those resources, you can see that some of the classical, and the reason I say classical definitions is that a lot of modern layout kind of ascribes to a bit more different approaches. And that's actually going to be covered by the advanced one. But essentially what this allows you to do is to have objects that flex. So this object is flexed across, let's say 5 or 6 columns. I can set its constraints. The constraints basically tell the object how to resize. I could set left and right constraints here. And then this way, when I resize this, I can see my component kind of follow suit. So if we were to talk about here, let's say if I were to grab a UI card and I were to bring that to my grid, I can determine how many grid units I want that UI card to occupy. I could actually take several and say that we're going to have 4 of these UI cards across, and notice they are now snapping. Now, when I set each of those objects to have left and right constraints, oops, I have to set them individually. Oh no, why can't I set this one? This is not my component. So let me, I'm gonna set up another component instance. That's from the simple design system. So there's probably something that's being applied that's breaking it. So I apologize. So here, I'm going to make a simple card. I'm going to select those 2 objects, press Shift-A, let's apply a little background color. I'm going to click padding of 20, and let's make that into a component. And let's see if this works. Should work. So left and right constraints. There we go. I don't know why these weren't working, but what we're going to do is then apply a stroke around the object and a little corner radius. And basically what we have here is you see that these objects with their constraints will then resize to flex within this layout. So here we go, I'm applying them there. And so you will see that they now kind of grow and expand based off of those column constraints. There's more to it, but at a nutshell, that's one way to consider it. So the difference would be is if you were to create a layout grid that was to be fixed. So I can instead choose to grow from the center, and then that way I can be specific about the width. I'm going to use my nudge to just increase this, and I could say I explicitly want, a width of 136 for my columns. And if I was to try to resize this, basically this stays centered. So the difference between the two is one is fully responsive, where the column width is dependent on the width of the device. The other one here is where you explicitly have the entire grid of objects centered with a fixed column width, right? And this is okay too. There's a lot of websites out there that what they do is they have given breakpoints, and that at a given breakpoint, they might adjust the columns and the column width that they have for their designs. So there's a bunch of different options that way. So the way that you copy them to follow the grid is to select it, you kind of snap it to those edges, And what you then do is apply a left and right constraint. And by having that left and right constraint, it will then kind of follow that layout. It's not going to do it here because the grid isn't stretched. But if I were to set that grid to be stretched, then I can snap those edges to the sides and then it'll work appropriately. Let's put a little stroke on it so you can see that better. And there's ways that like you can use a number of different auto layout tricks with like min and max in accomplishing that. But back to I called myself the man of many tangents the other day, and I feel like I'm definitely living up to that. Let's start again with a frame. I'm going to make this frame. Let's just make it 1280 by 720. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a grid that's going to allow us to have bento boxes here. This is often referred to as a modular grid. And so when I select this frame, I'm going to go to my layout grid. I'm going to apply columns. Here, I'm going to put in, let's say 12 columns, a margin of, let's say 48, a gutter of 16. I could actually probably bring that down. Let's go 32. So a margin of 32, a gutter of 16. So that means that the margins are double the gutters in there. Then I can add another layout grid and I can set this as my rows. And here as my rows, I can then bring that down to 6. We can add in the same gutter, which is 16, and the same margin, which is 32. So what we've done is created effectively a modular grid here. So you can see when I increase the width and the height, the width of the columns and the rows are then dependent on that. So one thing you could do here, if you ever wanted to create like a bento style mood board, I could press the R key and I could draw in various modules and it'll snap to all of those edges. So I could draw in like another one here, right? I could duplicate that, move that down, duplicate it there. Let's say this one here, could snap it down. And once again, remember the toggle for grid is Shift G. So you can see how this is applied in kind of making this layout. So there we go. I could add in some more of these and it gives you a sense of how this works together. Now, if you wanted to start to implement some text to be a descriptor here, let's say I'm kind of making this all up, we can then impart. How do I duplicate without dragging? Command D or Control D. So once I've duplicated an object and I've moved it, I can press Command D and it'll duplicate another one. So I hold down the Option key, I drag this down, and it already knows that movement. I hit Command D and it creates another one in that perfect space. So as mentioned, if I wanted to address this layout and have text that then also sits on these larger lines, I could type in mood board design. And once again, to get this text to line up exactly on these points, someone mentioned to me cover, what was it? The line height trim. Basically vertical trim just cuts off spacing from the top and the bottom. It could be found under the typography advanced panel settings. You could turn on vertical trim. It doesn't so much affect the overall like line height value as it does just trims the top and bottom of your text there. So here I can still set and have a line height that matches my layout. So this is going to be right here. This is a value of 112. So if my line height is 112, and I can increase my font size, you'll notice that'll push my baseline off. But as long as I re-snap it, you can see that every line matches up and the line height is going to be there. This was something that was kind of like mysterious to me when I was an earlier career designer. And just understanding the math behind this has been super helpful as I begin to kind of like work on those layouts. And independent of the font. Different fonts are going to have a baseline at a different placement. So if you adjust your font, sometimes you do need to adjust that snap to make sure it is working appropriately. I actually have a video on YouTube that kind of walks through how to use this in coordination with auto layout, because auto layout, sometimes you have to account for an extra value in that spacing in between. So yeah, you can totally do the math on it, but this is what I'm doing is when I'm initially kind of walking through these values, this is how I adjust that math. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about gridding some devices. And so when you're working with devices, you want to consider various things. One good example that I would recommend is check out Stripe. It's not going to pull up here. Let me just change my screen share. Hold on one quick moment. I'm only sharing my Figma window, not everything else. But when you go to Stripe's website, I really like the way that they highlight the use of grid in their layout. It's very faint, but you can see how they're using it to align their elements, how elements span across multiple grid lines, how they apply padding and spacing in between these. So you'll notice that with a lot of sites that are using grid appropriately, it's going to translate into your understanding of CSS grid. So when working with a phone layout, I oftentimes will work with a particular like grid style. So some folks might refer to this as like a 4-column layout. Some people refer to it as like a 1-column layout. But when you apply in 4, you apply in your margins. So I put a margin of 32, let's say a gutter of 16. This then can become like a governing position for your elements. The one reason that I'm bringing this up is that when you're thinking about adding in additional objects, when you're adding in like additional objects and you're thinking about like cards or elements that might then scroll, what you want to do is you need to consider how objects sit outside of the grid. So then that way you have a visual affordance for them to scroll, right? So the grid still serves a purpose when working with icons, when placing objects. You might actually have as well what is referred to as a key line in a design. So I know we haven't talked about this yet, but when you press Shift R, you can actually employ very specific guidelines, grid lines. So this could be like a key line that you might define in your layout that's going to work in here. And so the one thing that I do want to highlight about these grid lines is that when they are outside of a frame, they're global. And when they're inside of a frame, they are local. So you have a much better sense of how an object is placed. Whenever you are working, you also want to consider having within here your flush lines. So what that means is you might go ahead and create another layout grid. So let's say I'm creating those columns. I remove the gutters. And then I go down to this point. And what you could do is I usually pull them from the center and I increase the width. And those flush lines help you better understand what are the midpoints in your design. So if you have objects that are aligned to one another and they're touching, then you're better able to match that up. So a tablet oftentimes is referred with an 8-column layout. So if I go in here and I put in an 8-column layout, I can do the same thing where I apply like a more open gutter, like a matching gutter and a matching margin. So let's say 48. And then once again, this just allows you to work with objects on that given level, considering how they might be pressed across that layout as well. So web is often referred to as a 12-column layout. However, you can really explore what are your main lines? What is the design that you're trying to drive? You don't always have to subscribe to the exact same one. But as mentioned, layout grid can help you get a good understanding of how this may work with CSS grid. I'm going to just cover one last concept before we close out here today and just point you to some resources. Somebody asked me, how do we manage a more complex layout that may have a fixed navigation, but then have additional columns? You can apply grid to any frame and then nest the frame into another layout. So here, what I've done is I have one row on the left-hand side. This is a one column layout. So this is 640 wide. This is another frame that has then been added into the design, and that then also has left and right constraints, which allows you to have it grow and be stretched while we have a fixed column on the left. So you can get creative with how you generate and how you work with these things. The one thing that I am going to leave you with is make sure you check out some of these resources. So this is an older version of Material Design's responsive grid layout, but I think it is a fantastic resource in digging into and understanding the use of grids with UI design. This is Stripe's website, which I love their employment of grids. This is a layout grid visualizer. It's made by another advocate on our team that allows you to burn in those layouts. So if you want to use it for documentation purposes, so if I was to take, let's say, this tablet layout and I want to visualize it on Canvas, I could hit Command K, type in layout grid visualizer plugin. And what it then does, even when I press Shift G, it keeps those grids there. It actually puts it in as its own little locked layer to help you visualize it if you're going to include it as part of your documentation. Take a look in this file. I also have a full run through on a grid system that I use for presentations. This is a 14 column grid system. The reason it is 14, just to allow for flexibility. I have the full breakdown, the full deconstruction of how space is divided in there. And then I also have how this then translates to text and how that text is aligned in that grid. So then that way you can implement that. I also have another section here that's employing the grid, but also using variables to create that grid. So if you are looking for a little bit more advanced content, this is actually using the construction of variables and aliased values to determine and generate the grid as well as the typographic scale. You can go into the local variables here, go under grid rows and grid columns, and see how that math is created to generate a presentation grid system. And lastly, check out the basic process design deck in Figma Slides. It is using this grid system here. It's applied to every single page, and you can see the benefit of using a grid with your layouts to create more mood board and bento style graphics in your layouts. The very last thing that I'm going to do here too, I'm just going to show you, I know we covered this mood board design, but I didn't show you how easy it is to add images. If you press Command K, type in place image. So Command K, place image. You could then pull images off of your desktop. So I have a whole gallery here of animals. I'm going to select them by holding the Shift key to select many. You'll notice that my cursor now has 6, and I'm able to easily place them there. So very last thing, I'll grab one more image and place it. So these are some of the shortcuts. I know that there was a lot here, a lot to think about, but this is layout grid basics. When you start digging into more advanced concepts and start implementing CSS grid, you're going to be dealing with the same column row layout, as well as thinking about how content expands beyond that. My intent here is just to show you how it works in Figma and some of the different ways that you can begin considering it. I would recommend applying grids to your layouts for presentations first, and then begin to think how it might work within your own design systems as you are building out your designs. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate y'all. Let's take a look at one. Let's see, one good last question. Do I always use grids in auto layout? I all depends. All depends on what it is that I'm doing and what it is that I'm working on. How do you make the layout grid menu float? I'm using UI3. When you click on the grid, it then pops up to the left. You can drag this over from the left. And then what are the best grid practices for presentations, desktop websites? It's a deep question, but one that I guarantee you will find answers for. Look through some of the resources. Another resource that I have here is the Apple developer documentation, where they talk about using layout grids with their devices. And this material design resource, I think, is fantastic for understanding the transition of the grids, the modules, and how it applies into broader website design. So thank you all for joining today. This will be posted up on YouTube. Feel free to follow up with additional questions and fill out that feedback form. We always greatly appreciate it. I think y'all are fantastic. Thanks for joining in from all over the world. Lauren, thank you. I appreciate you. And I hope y'all have a wonderful weekend.